Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. Just after finishing our high school finals, a group of friends and I decided to go camping near the remote town of Coldwater Springs. The weather was dreadful, constant drizzle and thick fog that seemed to blanket everything. The campground was nearly deserted, with only us and a group of scouts from a nearby town. With nothing better to do, we ended up hanging out with the scouts and the young guys who ran the activities on the site. On our last night, they offered to take us on a ghost walk, promising a tour of the old abandoned cabins at the far end of the campground. The walk was meant to be spooky, but it was so laughably tame that we started telling our own ghost stories instead. As the night wore on, we finally decided to head back to our tents. The fog had thickened, and we could barely see a few feet ahead of us. Our laughter echoed eerily across the empty field as we made our way back. Just as we were nearing our tents, Emily, one of my friends, suddenly stopped dead in her tracks and pointed ahead. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. We all looked in the direction she was pointing. There, about 30 feet away, was a short, white figure pacing in front of our tent. It was a solid, human-like shape, faintly glowing in the dark. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen in shock. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate motion, as if searching for something. One of the girls let out a scream, and as if triggered by the sound, the figure stopped pacing and turned towards us. It didn't just look at us. It rushed at us with a terrifying speed, its form blurring as it moved. Panic seized us, and we all bolted, running as fast as we could across the field. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and at one point, I lost my shoes in the mud, but I didn't stop. We didn't slow down until we reached the activities building, breathless and terrified. When we finally mustered the courage to go back with a group of scouts and some of the camp staff, armed with lanterns, there was nothing there. The figure had vanished, leaving no trace behind. We tried to rationalize it later. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or a patch of mist, but deep down, none of us really believed that. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that night. It hasn't put me off camping, though. If anything, it's made me even more curious about what might be out there, lurking in the dark. My brother and I decided to go on a camping trip deep in the woods of Pine Hollow. It wasn't an official campground, just a secluded spot we knew of where no one else ever went. We set up our tent, started a bonfire, and spent the evening drinking and chatting, enjoying the peaceful solitude. The stars were hidden by the dense canopy above us, but the firelight provided enough warmth and comfort. Around 2 a.m., we finally called it a night and settled into our sleeping bags. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I had just started drifting off when a noise jolted me awake. It was a sound I'll never forget, a mix of maniacal laughter and high-pitched screaming echoing through the trees. It seemed to come from above, as if the source was hovering somewhere in the air. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The laughter was accompanied by loud thuds, like something heavy falling from the trees and hitting the ground over and over. My brother was awake too, and we both stared at each other, wide-eyed, not daring to move. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity, each laugh more sinister than the last. We could hear rustling in the branches above us, but we didn't dare step outside the tent to see what it was. Eventually, the noises faded, leaving us in an uneasy silence. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and as soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up and left. To this day, we've never figured out what it was, but every time I think back to that night, I can still hear that terrifying laughter ringing in my ears. About a decade ago, my wife and I embarked on a road trip around the eastern coastline of Nova Scotia. We had planned the journey for months, eager to explore the picturesque landscapes and quaint coastal towns. Our itinerary included a mix of public and private campgrounds, each offering its own unique charm and views. The days were filled with adventure, hiking along rugged trails, exploring charming seaside villages, and indulging in local seafood. By evening, we'd set up camp, relishing the freedom of the open road and the tranquility of the natural surroundings. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, we found ourselves far from any official campground. The road had wound its way through dense forests and along scenic cliffs, leaving us miles away from the nearest town. We decided to stop at a small diner nestled in a remote area, hoping to find some information about where we could spend the night. Inside, the diner was cozy and welcoming, with a few locals enjoying their meals and the faint hum of conversation filling the air. We approached the counter and spoke to the waitress, an elderly woman with a warm smile and kind eyes. She listened intently as we explained our situation and asked if she knew of any nearby camping spots. After a moment of thought, she told us about a public park situated on a cliff overlooking the ocean, near the small town of Seawind. According to her, the park was a hidden gem, offering stunning views and a peaceful retreat. She mentioned that it was a bit off the beaten path, but assured us it would be perfect for an overnight stay. Grateful for the tip, we thanked her and set off in the direction she had indicated. As we drove toward Seawind, the sun began its descent, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The road narrowed and twisted, eventually leading us to the park just as twilight began to settle in. The area was indeed as isolated as the waitress had described, with only a few scattered lights visible in the distance. We found the park nearly deserted, except for an older couple parked in a fifth wheel at the far end of the lot. The park featured a small grassy area near the edge of the cliff, with a stunning view of the ocean crashing against the rocks below. Dominating the landscape was an old lighthouse perched on the cliff, its light blinking on and off in a steady rhythm. The sight was both picturesque and slightly eerie, as the lighthouse cast intermittent shadows that played tricks on our eyes. Despite the beauty of the setting, the persistent flicker of the lighthouse light seemed to cast an unsettling aura over the scene. We set up our tent on the grassy area, positioning it close to the edge of the cliff to fully appreciate the view. The sound of the waves crashing below was soothing, and we settled in for what we hoped would be a peaceful night. However, as darkness enveloped the park, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. Around 2 a.m., as we were attempting to sleep, we started hearing strange noises coming from the woods that bordered the clearing. At first, it was just a faint, eerie moaning that seemed to drift on the wind. But as the minutes ticked by, the sounds grew more distinct and varied. There was a haunting humming, mixed with what sounded like faint crying. The noises seemed to form a dissonant chorus that filled the night air, creating a sense of dread that was impossible to ignore. Each time the lighthouse light flashed, it illuminated the walls of our tent, casting long, shifting shadows that made us half expect to see ghostly figures just outside. The noises from the woods grew louder and more insistent, as if whatever was making them was drawing nearer. Our minds raced with fears of what could be lurking in the darkness beyond our sight. The hours dragged on, and the sounds continued unabated. We lay in our sleeping bags, clutching each other for comfort, our hearts pounding with terror. The moaning and crying seemed to echo through the trees, mingling with the occasional distant thud, adding to the atmosphere of unease. By the time the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, we were exhausted and terrified. We wasted no time packing up our gear, eager to leave behind the eerie park and its unsettling noises. The once picturesque location now felt like a place we were all too eager to escape. As we drove away, the haunting sounds seemed to linger in our minds, a chilling reminder of the night we spent in that ghostly place. We never spoke much about that night, preferring to leave it as a strange and unsettling memory. But every now and then, when the wind howls outside our window or when we find ourselves in a quiet, dark place, we're both reminded of those strange, haunting sounds that came from the woods. The experience remains a mysterious and eerie chapter in our travels. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful places can also hold unsettling secrets. A friend and I were deep into our backpacking adventure along the Appalachian Trail in northern Pennsylvania, tackling some of the most demanding sections of the trail. The rugged terrain was both beautiful and brutal, featuring steep climbs, rocky outcrops, and dense forests that seemed to stretch on endlessly. We had been hiking since dawn, pushing ourselves through the challenging landscape, determined to reach our goal. After a grueling morning spent climbing a particularly massive hill, we were both exhausted and ready for a break. We had planned to stop at a shelter another 2 miles ahead, knowing there would be a reliable water source there to replenish our supplies. The thought of resting and rehydrating kept us going, even as our legs protested with every step. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the trail, we finally reached the shelter. To our surprise, we found someone already there, a man with an old, weather-beaten backpack that looked like it had seen better days. He was rummaging through a nearly empty bag of Fritos, his movements slow and deliberate. His presence immediately struck us as odd. Unlike other hikers we'd encountered, this man seemed out of place. He had no proper gear, no fresh supplies, and there was a strange, almost desperate aura about him. His clothes were tattered, and his backpack seemed barely functional. There was something unsettling about the way he stared at us, as if he was scrutinizing us rather than simply sharing the space. We tried to engage him in conversation, making small talk about our hike and asking if he was day hiking or planning a longer trek. His responses were vague and evasive, almost as if he was trying to avoid any real interaction. When we asked him for his trail name, a common practice among hikers to identify one another, he hesitated before mumbling, it's Hatchet. The name sounded like an afterthought, and we noticed he was gripping a small pack axe with an unsettling tightness. Despite the odd encounter, we didn't think much of it at the time. We shrugged it off as meeting another eccentric character on the trail and continued with our plans. Hatchet, as he called himself, packed up quickly and left the shelter without much of a word. We watched him disappear down the trail, his silhouette gradually fading into the growing darkness. That night, we set up our hammocks at a secluded campsite a few miles further along the trail. The site was nestled among the trees, offering some privacy and protection from the elements. We carefully secured our gear. With my backpack wrapped around the tree my hammock was attached to, hoping it would be safe from any potential wildlife or wandering hikers. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by an unsettling, rustling sound. My hammock was shaking, and the sensation of something moving close by made my heart race. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what was happening. That's when I saw him. Hatchet was standing over me, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but his presence unmistakable. He was rummaging through my pack, his hands moving with a quick, almost frantic desperation. Fear surged through me, and I shouted, trying to make my voice as loud and authoritative as possible. Our eyes locked for a brief, chilling moment. Hatchet's expression was a disturbing mix of anger and fear, and before I could react further, he bolted into the darkness, vanishing into the woods. My friend and I scrambled out of our hammocks, adrenaline pumping as we grabbed our flashlights and began searching the area. The woods were pitch black, and despite our frantic search, Hatchet was long gone. We couldn't find any trace of him, and the forest felt eerily silent once more. The next morning, we inspected our gear and discovered that Hatchet had stolen a pack of tuna and some granola bars. It was a small loss, but the violation of our space and the fear of the encounter left us shaken. We packed up quickly, our thoughts swirling with the unsettling events of the night. When we reached the next town and stopped at a diner for lunch, we were greeted by an unexpected sight, a wanted poster on the door. It featured a sketch of Hatchet, though his real name was unknown, and detailed his involvement in recent crimes, including mugging and assault. The realization hit us like a cold wave, and we reported our encounter to the local police, hoping it would help in their search. We never found out if they caught Hatchet or what happened to him after our encounter. The memory of that night, the sight of him standing over me in the dark, the eerie rustling in the woods, still sends chills down my spine. It's a haunting reminder of the unpredictability of the trail and the unsettling reality that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those you least expect. Our family camping trip to Black Pine Forest was intended to be a refreshing escape from the daily grind of city life. The plan was simple: enjoy the great outdoors, reconnect with nature, and spend quality time together as a family. My husband, our two daughters, Emma and Lily, and I had been looking forward to this adventure for weeks. We arrived at the campground in the late afternoon, greeted by the forest's serene beauty. Towering trees and lush greenery surrounded us, creating the perfect backdrop for our camping getaway. We found a picturesque spot beside a gently flowing creek and began setting up our tent. The site was ideal, nestled among the trees with a clear view of the sky, perfect for stargazing later. As we worked, Emma and Lily eagerly helped, gathering firewood and arranging our camping gear. With the tent finally pitched and our campsite organized, we lit the campfire and settled down to enjoy the evening. The night was calm and beautiful. The sky was a blanket of twinkling stars and the air was crisp and cool. We roasted marshmallows over the fire, the sweet smell of the burning sugar mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. We told stories, shared laughs, and savored the simple pleasures of being together. It was everything we had hoped for: a peaceful retreat from the chaos of everyday life. As the evening wore on and the fire began to die down, we decided it was time to head to bed. We zipped up the tent, making sure everything was secure, and got into our sleeping bags. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of nocturnal creatures. Just as we were about to drift off to sleep, a faint rhythmic tapping noise interrupted the tranquility. At first, we thought it was just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps a small branch brushing against the tent. But the sound grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't the gentle patter of rain, but rather a series of soft, repetitive thuds, as if something was falling onto the roof of our tent from above. My husband Mark unzipped the tent and stepped outside with a flashlight, determined to figure out the source of the noise. The sight that met him was both bizarre and unsettling. The ground around our tent was covered in beetles, hundreds of them, crawling over each other in a chaotic, frenzied mass. They were dark and shiny, their tiny legs moving rapidly as they scattered across the forest floor. To our horror, it became apparent that the beetles weren't just on the ground, they were also falling from the trees above. They landed on our tent and the surrounding ground with soft, creepy thuds, creating a disturbing rhythm that seemed to resonate throughout the night. The scene was both fascinating and grotesque, with the beetles continuing their relentless descent from the canopy. We were baffled and a bit grossed out by the sight. Mark suggested we move the tent, but the idea of packing up in the dark with beetles raining down on us was far from appealing. We debated our options, but ultimately decided to stay put, hoping the phenomenon would pass. We hoped it was just a temporary occurrence and that the beetles would eventually disperse. The tapping and thudding continued all night long, relentless and unyielding. Despite our exhaustion, none of us could sleep. The constant sound of tiny bodies hitting the tent, coupled with the creepy feeling of insects crawling over the ground around us, created an atmosphere of unease. Emma and Lily, who had been so excited for the camping trip, were now wide awake and frightened, their imaginations running wild with thoughts of what might be causing this strange event. By the time dawn broke, the beetles had vanished, leaving behind only a few scattered shells and the lingering memory of their eerie presence. The forest seemed to have returned to its normal state, but the sense of relief was tinged with the remnants of our unsettling night. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, eager to leave the forest and its bizarre inhabitants behind. As we drove away from Black Pine Forest, the experience felt surreal, like something out of a strange dream. We tried to rationalize what had happened, but no explanation seemed to fit. The memory of those beetles falling from the trees continued to give us the creeps, a haunting reminder of the night when nature seemed to turn against us. To this day, whenever we go camping or hear the sound of something tapping against a surface, the memory of that night resurfaces, sending a shiver down my spine. It remains an inexplicable and eerie chapter in our family's outdoor adventures, a reminder that sometimes, even in the most beautiful settings, the unexpected can happen. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to stay in a secluded cabin in Arkansas, perched on the banks of a serene river. The location was breathtaking, with the cabin nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and a view that seemed to stretch endlessly over the water. It was the kind of place you see in brochures promising peace, tranquility, and an escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The cabin itself was a quaint, rustic structure with a cozy charm. One side of the cabin was almost entirely made of glass, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of the river and the dense forest beyond. During the day, the natural light flooded the interior, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. However, as dusk fell and the light began to fade, the expansive windows started to feel less like a feature and more like a vulnerability. There were no blinds or curtains to cover the windows, leaving the entire side of the cabin exposed to the darkness outside. The first time the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows deepened, I found myself increasingly on edge. The outside world became an impenetrable black void, and the cabin, once a haven, felt more like a stage under a spotlight, where unseen eyes could be watching from the darkness beyond the glass. The unease grew as night settled in, and with it came an unsettling series of events. It began with a sound, a relentless, rhythmic beating that seemed to come from all sides of the cabin. The noise was loud, sharp, and unnervingly fast-paced, as if something or someone was striking the walls in a rapid succession. The sound would start on one side, then move to the next, and even up to the roof, creating a disorienting effect that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. It felt as though the cabin itself was being assaulted by an invisible force. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside, but the intensity and speed of the sound were far from natural. My heart raced as the beating continued, the noise resonating through the cabin, making it impossible to ignore. The feeling of being watched, already heightened by the uncovered windows, now became almost unbearable. As if the strange noises weren't enough, the cabin's gas-powered fireplace began to act up. Without warning, it would suddenly roar to life, the flames flaring up as if fueled by some unseen force, only to abruptly die down and go out, plunging the room back into darkness. This happened several times throughout the night, each time more startling than the last. Then there was the television. It would turn on by itself, the screen flickering to life and displaying nothing but static. The white noise and snowy screen seemed almost cliché, like something out of a horror movie, yet there it was, happening right before my eyes. I would turn the TV off, only for it to snap back on minutes later, the static filling the room with its eerie hum. The most unnerving part, however, was the whispering. At night, when everything else was quiet, I could hear faint voices, indistinguishable and barely audible, but definitely there. They seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, even from outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was hushed and urgent, as if trying to communicate something just out of reach. The whispers combined with the other strange occurrences made sleep nearly impossible. By the time the first night drew to a close, I was too terrified to sleep with the lights off. The darkness felt oppressive, filled with unseen threats and inexplicable phenomena. I decided to leave the hall light on and shut and lock the bedroom door, hoping that a barrier between me and whatever was happening in the rest of the cabin would offer some sense of security. But even that small comfort was soon shattered. As I lay in bed, trying to calm my racing heart, I began to notice shadows moving under the door. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but as the shadows continued to shift and dart back and forth, it became clear that something or someone was outside the bedroom, pacing the hallway just beyond the door. The shapes were indistinct, but the way they moved was deliberate, purposeful, and utterly terrifying. My fear reached its peak, and I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. Whatever was happening, whether it was the result of poor construction, some prank, or something far more sinister, I didn't care to find out. The shadows under the door were the final straw. I quickly packed up what I could, waking my husband in a panic, and we got the hell out of there. As we drove away from the cabin, my heart still pounding in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. The events of that night remained a mystery, and despite our attempts to rationalize what had happened, the experience left a deep impression on me. In the years since, I've often reflected on that night in the cabin by the river. The memory still sends chills down my spine, but strangely enough, it's also become one of my fondest camping memories. There's something about the thrill of the unknown, the brush with the inexplicable, that has stayed with me. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating in a way that only the truly unexplainable can be. Camping, with all its uncertainties and potential for adventure, remains something I cherish, even after that unsettling experience. If anything, it's made me more curious, more eager to explore the mysteries that nature might hold. And who knows, maybe one day I'll return to a cabin like that one, ready to face whatever the night might bring. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.